A couple of things up front. First of all, I'm Welsh, I'm not English. Now you know that. All right, any reference to me as English is an unforgivable insult, and my children will seek out your children under the seventh generation. I can take that seriously. But one of the characteristics of the Welsh is we speak very quickly. In fact, Welsh, the first letter of every noun changes according to the word that comes before it. Yeah, so Wales is Cymru, beginning with a C. If you want to say the Welsh, it becomes a Gymru. The C changes to a G. The reason it does it, you may think it's complicated, it isn't. Just speak it quickly and it will happen naturally. Welsh has evolved so you can sing a sentence as a word, all right? So if I start to do that, feel free to tell me to slow down. Because the Welsh version of English is worse than Swinglish, in that sense, right? Second thing is, if you disagree with something, you want to ask a question, just pop it up, all right? There's no problem. I'm probably going to have 2 sessions for you to discuss and answer questions as we go through this, all right? Just to break in on it. I reserve the right to say I'm going to do that later, and you should reserve the right to check I actually do, all right? In that sense. Yeah. And just to give you a clue, if I say that's a good question, that was done to me once in Australia. This guy was asking, and I said, that's a good question. Yeah, board member of big construction company. And he said, I didn't ask you to rate my question, you pommy bastard. I asked you to answer it, all right? So I gift you that one because it's a good way of dealing with people who are trying to create time. Right? I wasn't going to use this, but being as Everest came up last time, and about 2-3 years ago, I was actually on the Annapurna Sanctuary walk, stuck in a blizzard in the sanctuary itself, actually watching the film with some of the Sherpas who were on the expedition where that really arrogant guy killed people because he wouldn't give up and he was stuck in that sort of, I'm the leader, I can do it. And I use this with a lot of when I'm at a conference with a lot of motivational speakers, because they're all sort of saying, it's all about leadership and motivation and, the dream, the impossible. And I spend a lot of my time trekking in mountains, and if you haven't got the experience and you're not prepared, all of that goes crap. Yeah, so one of the things I'm going to argue, although I'm going to be talking about complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity, and I'm also going to be talking about the discipline that goes with that. You'll find a lot of people into complexity, particularly the sort of postmodernists, and I pity postmodernists. It's time they grew up. Reality exists. Live with it. Yeah, who actually use complexity as an excuse for saying you don't manage. And the reality is you need to manage with a greater discipline. So kind of like upfront thing. Anybody know the origin of the word manage in English? Okay, it comes from the Italian. I can never pronounce it, and I've really got to train myself to do this. Menagore, I think, the ability to ride a horse in dressage. Yeah, it then gets corrupted by the French. Many things have been corrupted by the French, not as many as by the English, but many. Yeah, to mean household management, and that's how it translates into modern management theory. So if you think about managing ordered, structured systems as household management, and managing complex systems as riding a horse in dressage, that's actually quite a good metaphor because it requires training and experience, but you can get precision of output. Yeah, so it's about discipline. So just hold that image because I'm going to use that. Yeah? Now, if you go back to Aristotle, and I should tell you now, my first degree is philosophy and physics as a joint honours, which was an indulgence when I did it, but has proved quite useful since. All right. The trouble is, it led to a total contempt for social science from 2 completely different disciplines, and I really haven't shaken it off yet. All right. From a physicist's point of view, no social scientist ever gets enough data to draw any valid conclusion whatsoever, and I'm going to build on that in a minute. Right. But if you go back to Aristotle, he talks about Sophia and Pronesis. Which is actually theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. And the point is the 2 have to go together. Yeah, practice without theory is just random chance. Theory without practice is ineffective. Yeah? And the sort of phrase we developed that, and the approach I started to adopt, was to say, well, under conditions of uncertainty, you can't use case-based approaches. You can't go and study 50 companies who've been successful, identify that all of their managing directors play golf, and then have golf lessons as the way of determining who your managers are. I do that with a degree of satirical intent, all right? The confusion of correlation with causation is endemic in social science. Yeah, it's a real issue.
And for example, if Sweden wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes, and given that you award them in the first place, yeah, we all know about the guilt trip associated with that, but we won't go into that, then the way you do it is to increase consumption of dark chocolate. I mean, this is good news if you think about it, because the consumption of dark chocolate per head of population directly correlates with Nobel Prizes per head of population for the last 30 years. So there's an obvious solution. Now, if you look at it, virtually every management theory makes the same error. Somebody goes and studies a limited number of cases, identifies they think in having in common, then they make this massively stupid loop and say, if you do these things, you too will get the same results. Yeah, and that is 90% of management science, probably 95%. And it actually doesn't work because it's context-free in a context-specific world, a thing I'll come back to. So what I started to do when I was IBM and say, well, actually, there's a better approach. Natural science gives us a whole body of validated knowledge. Yeah, if you put forward a thesis in natural science, other people can conduct the experiment, which means we're very dubious about anything from psychology because none of their experiments ever get replicated. Yeah. People have been trying to replicate the classic experiments the last few years and it doesn't work. Yeah. But for most natural science, I can replicate the experiments, I can therefore rely on it. So I can tell you things about systems and about human cognition, which are correct. So I need to build methods and tools coherent to that science, rather than trying to pretend the science doesn't exist. So what I'm going to do in this first section is give you a rapid run through of some of the most significant scientific understandings which relate to management. Yeah? The good news is once you get these, and there aren't very many of them, it's actually very easy to handle uncertainty. Because you don't fall back to an established method, you do things consistent with the theory. So it makes life easier in that sense. And by the way, complexity is sometimes called the science of common sense. So think about practice as we go through. The phrase we used to have for this in the 70s was praxis makes perfect, by the way. So the other phrase for this is naturalizing sense making. Naturalizing in philosophy says to actually relate to the natural sciences. Cornwell for naturalizing epistemology and Quine. Sense making I use with a hyphen. Yeah. I'm currently writing the chapter on sense making for the new Routledge Handbook on Systems Thinking. And there are significant differences between Weick, Klein, myself, and Brenda Dervin. There's actually a whole body of academic articles which actually look at those differences. So what you're going to get is the naturalizing approach to sense making. Weick is a observe, form expert opinion, write papers. Yeah, Klein and myself are what does the science say, check the science in practice, see does what it means. So that's kind of like the approach we're going to go for. Yeah, and there's a comparative articles if you want it. So just let me finally kill off case-based approaches with three effects. One is called the Cobra effect. This is from the English in India. When the Welsh say English and when we say British, yeah, it's kind of like has significance, right? So this is the English in India. They decided there were too many hooded cobras. Having had a couple of close encounters, I agree with them. You know, Rikki Tikki Tavi is my hero, for those who know their Kipling. And basically, they decided the way to deal with this was to have an incentive. Sound familiar? So 1 rupee for every cobra head bought into the British Commission. Worked really well for a month until people realized how much money there was to be had in breeding cobras. So cobra farms set up in backyards all over India produced a really useful redistribution of income until the English realized what was going on and cancelled the reward, at which point the cobras were let loose into the wild and the overall cobra population increased. All right, what happens when government announces a major new initiative on some type of citizen engagement? Everybody polishes off their pet theory, uses find and replace in a word processor, and tries to match the declared purpose. The same is true in organizations. Yeah? It's actually really scary when you look at it. If you declare your purpose, you can't trust how people respond. Right? And that's actually really important in terms of leadership. We'll come on to this later. You're better reinforcing things which go in the right direction once they start to move than declaring what you want, because I guarantee you the more important you are, the more you are certain to get what you asked for, even if reality doesn't match it. And that's called Cobra effect. And consultants are very, very prone to this, by the way, in terms of what they see. Second is butterfly effect, the famous cliche. So the idea here, you've all heard it, a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazonian rainforest. it causes a hurricane in Texas. Now, it's not a causal link. I know Texans. If butterflies were causing hurricanes, by now they'd have been subject to vigilante action with extreme prejudice involving guns followed up by large walls. Yeah? The point is that something very small on this occasion combines with other small things to create a massive effect. Right? The fact that 3 people produce an original piece of software in their parents' garage doesn't mean that every time 3 people come into a garage, they will produce original software. Yeah, a huge amount of the phenomenon we talk about and try and copy is actually a butterfly effect. It's a unique context which magnified, and one of the things I'll do in tomorrow's session is talk about apex predator theory, which is one of the big new things in strategy, which says, when is the system ready to change? Because only then should you do novel things. Now, I'm going to talk about that in the context of design thinking, which is in desperate need of change, but that's for later. Yeah? And then we get Hawthorne effect. This is the final killer punch for anybody who likes running pilot projects. So back in the 1920s, they decided, height of scientific management, early days of Taylor, they decided to see what people may pay more productive. So they increased lighting levels in a factory. People became more productive. These days, they would now publish a book called Light, the Secret to Productivity. Yeah, dine out on the speaker fees and have certificates for people based on how many light switches they could switch on after a 3-day paid training course. I mean, this is designed for the agile people amongst you. Right? IBM, by the way, is now certifying agile thought leaders with a little badge. God help us. Right? Either way, then they had some pretensions to be real scientists, so they lowered the lighting level, and guess what? People became more productive. And what they found, which has been validated since, is do something novel and pay attention to people, and it nearly always works the first 2 or 3 times, but it won't scale. So single pilots are very dangerous because they're more or less guaranteed to work, but they won't scale. And when we come back to that, when I start to talk about Cynefin later, we'll talk about the work we do, which is multiple parallel contradictory micropilots. Yeah, rather than a single pilot, because a single pilot is actually very dangerous because it's bound to work. And if all of that wasn't enough, let's come on to basic science number 1. If you take radiologists, and remember, I don't know what radiologists have done to offend the cognitive neuroscience community, but they've done something, because all the experiments on cognitive blindness are done on them, right? So radiologists, 3 to 4 generation body of knowledge, 10 or 15 years average experience and training. You give them a batch of X-rays and ask them to look for anomalies. On the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, and 83% don't see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the scary thing is the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83%. This is called weak signal detection. And most of what you're going to hear today came from the work I did with DARPA on counterterrorism before and after 9/11, where we were really focused on the issue about how do you find the things that you later realize were highly significant, but you don't notice at the time. And that's been my speciality now for 20 years. Now, this is important because finding the 17% is critical, but it's also why companies go under. This is the explanation, yeah, for what Clayton Christensen came up of competence-induced failure. You don't fail because you're incompetent, you fail because you're too competent in the old way of seeing things, so you don't see something novel. And for those of you who are consultants, this is really dangerous, because you literally will not see things in organizations if you're not expecting to see them. Now, trying to say you can overcome this with training is a fundamental error. You can't. The only way you can make sure that human beings see everything is move them right to the autistic end of the spectrum. Because actually at that point, you see everything and you pay attention to everything. And that's why you can't cope, because you're getting too much stimulation. And we all, by the way, this is Andy Clark's work, sit somewhere on the spectrum between full autism and Donald Trump. At one end, you see everything objectively. At the other end, you only see the thing. Everything gets this Lacanian perversion as well for the psychologists. Everything is conformed to your ego needs. Now, the scary thing is we all sit somewhere on that spectrum with varying degrees of scale on that at different times. And we need to acknowledge that. Yeah? And the reason why this is the case, by the way, is for everybody in this room, the most you see on what's in front of you, if you're really paying attention, I mean like really paying attention, is 5% of the available information. If you're Chinese, it's 10%. There's actually a different cognitive function here. It's linked with language. So Mandarin, you have to understand the context of every symbol. You can't say something precisely, so you get a context-object difference. So Chinese will tend to scan more, but may not see significant objects. Yeah, these are plus or minus type features. But for everyone in this room, most of the time, 2 or 3%. You then do a first fit pattern match with patterns stored in your long-term memory, and in your body, and in your tools, and in your social action. Just so you know it, Cartesian concepts of consciousness, the assumption that the mind directs is all your consciousness, are basically flawed. Consciousness is a distributed function of the body, the mind, its social interactions, and its tools. Yeah, that's called post-Cartesian. And that's actually really important to understand, because a huge amount of models of human consciousness assume we're computers. Yeah, and some constantly, we won't go into that too much, questions are coming, but that's actually quite dangerous. Computers are good at things that human beings are bad at, and vice versa. And we need to start educating kids to do the things that human beings are good at, rather than trying to mold them into be slightly less effective computers, which is kind of like one of the problems, but that's a separate line. Yeah? So what you do is a radiologist has 30 to 40,000 patterns, and they do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. Because we haven't got time to make decisions. Think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa. Something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to deal with lions? By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of how to survive the digestive tract of a large carnivore, written by a purported survivor. Yeah? We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan and to act immediately. Yeah? Linked to that, we also evolved to make decisions in extended families and clans, and that's how we overcome cognitive bias. Yeah, and there's actually a size limit on that of about 150. That's Dunbar's number. Yeah, it's a neocortex limit. Dunbar actually argues the neocortex is the size it is because 150 is the optimal size for a hunter-gatherer community, and you have to have intimate knowledge of all the people in the network so you can actually act as a collective sensor network. Now, I'm going to come back to that at the end, because the way we overcome blindness is we get lots of people to look at the problem in real time, and we create fitness landscapes or maps to show divergence within the system so we can find outliers before we even start to interview people. Yeah, this is called distributed ethnography, yeah, in terms of the way it works. So I'm going to come back to solutions, but that's kind of like the problem. As I say, there are many implications for this. That's one of my favorite pictures, all right? You can start to work out the significance of it if you look at it. That's most management consultants, all right? Yeah, you can work on it, all right? Just think about it, right? We don't expect what we do not expect to see. It also means we need to move from lessons learned to lessons learning. Just to throw the other nasty thing in place, you do not remember things, yeah, the way you actually did them if you wait more than about an hour before you record it. Yeah, literally, we do not remember things the way we actually did them if we wait a bit for reflection, because people describe the past in terms of the political context of the present. That's just what we are as a species. So our work now involves capturing lessons learned at the point of knowledge acquisition, not as a reflective process later. And of course, if teams have succeeded, they remember things differently. Yeah, we did a big program on this in IBM. It's up there with me for the 6-month process I did, which proved that astrology was more accurate than Myers-Briggs, which HR paid for and never forgave me for. But as I pointed out, astrology has had, thousands of years of working out how to say things with the right level of ambiguity so you believe they're objective. It's relatively recent for Myers-Briggs and Hay Consulting, all right? But that was another matter. But the other one was actually fascinating. So we took teams outsourcing, if you don't know it, is a massive expenditure commitment for a company like IBM. You might have spent 5 or 6 million of the company's money, and one day you've won or lost the bid. If they'd won 1 bid in Wales, I wouldn't be here now. I'd be stuck in a research centre in Cardiff University. But we lost it. Yeah? And it's a big commitment, right? So basically what we did is a lessons learned process the day before teams knew whether they'd won or lost. And then we repeated the exact same process scripted the day afterwards. This is an easy thing to run, by the way. It's always worth running in a company. And you would think you were talking about completely different universes. The story people knew before they knew whether they'd won or lost was the richest story, because it was a contingent story and people were holding all the possibilities open because they didn't know what was going to happen. For teams who won, it was actually the most limited story we saw because they only remembered the things which actually justified their brilliance in doing the right thing at the right time. And the teams who failed only remembered the bad luck, bad judgment, and lack of allocation. Yeah, and nobody was being malicious, nobody was being evil, but you can't trust retrospective coherence in humans to give you accurate data. Yeah, so the switch from lessons learned to lessons learning is actually a key principle, and particularly true if you're doing consultancy. Ritual triggers are quite important. One of the ways that we actually see things in different ways is through ritual. We've done a lot of work on this in safety. So with New Zealand lorry drivers, this was a fun project in IBM days. It was off-road safety in New Zealand, so I thought, I'm doing that. I'm the boss, I can do it. You know, off-road New Zealand, Lord of the Rings territory. Nobody told me it was Wellington Harbour at 5 o'clock in the morning in winter. Anybody been to Wellington Harbour at 5 o'clock in winter? Well, let's just say the wind is coming horizontally with hail from the Antarctic with nothing to stop it, all right? It's bloody cold, right? What we actually found, and this was a narrative exercise, we put students into lorries to act as assistants for 2 weeks to gather narrative, which created a social obligation. We found the vast majority of accidents were happening in the 10 to 15 minutes after a lorry arrived at the quay and the guy got out and started to unload and load it. Now, because we know the science of this, we know the reason is they're patterning trained about driving. They've been driving for 200 miles. So those are the surface patterns. And it's taking time to reset. So rather than just have notices, what we did is gave them heated belts. You know the belts that you plug into the socket? And there was a very simple rule that we could enforce. You don't unload the lorry till you strap your belt on. And strapping on the belt was a cognitive trigger to bring a different set of patterns to the foreground. So then we actually halved accidents. If you don't believe this, check when you get into your car driving home. You'll find you go through a set of little rituals. Yeah, what you're actually doing is cognitively resetting so you can apply the right patterns. Yeah, so ritual is actually one of the really important intervention techniques in companies. And getting people to go through ritual acts of transition, for example, changing clothes, can be very significant. With the Singapore police, I've done a lot of work with them. All the senior officers now keep uniforms in their closet, and they put on their uniforms for some meetings because they see the world differently in uniform than they do in civilian clothes. I was in an Agile conference in Lisbon late last year, and we had to wear dinner jackets. I mean, I had to go out and buy one, right? And it was years since I worn a dinner jacket, but by the time I put it on and tied the bow tie and everything, I am seeing the world in a very, very different light. Yeah, so just think cognitive activation is key, and identifying actual rituals which exist is important. And finally, a framework I created some time ago is called See, Attend, Act, model of sense making. It says, do I see the data? Do I pay attention to the data? Do I act on the data? Are 3 separate processes. And the trouble is, most modern decision theory says if you put the right information in front of the right people at the right time and they have the right training and the right competencies, they will make the right decisions. That's the fundamental basis of most HR practice. It's complete and utter nonsense. In fact, the whole idea of core competencies has no basis whatsoever in science. I'm going to come back to a bit of that later. Right? The reality is whether you see something is an open question. Whether you pay attention to it if you see it is another question. And whether you can act on it even if you paid attention to it is another one again. And so to give an example, we did a whole 1-week process after 9/11. The nice thing about working in the States is that you get the previous administration as research subjects because everything churns. So we had the whole of Clinton's Al-Qaeda team, including Al Gore. And if you don't know it, Clinton had predicted 9/11. Yeah, when Bush came in, there were actually plans to have F-14s in permanent patrol above New York and Washington with authority to shoot down civilian aircraft. It was going to be a presidential order, yeah, which if Gore hadn't been displaced by a judicial coup, would have actually been signed. Yeah, but then the Bush administration came in and their whole election had been Clinton paranoia about Al-Qaeda. Yeah, so that order was cancelled. Now, I remember asking Gore in this meeting, do you really think you would have signed it? And he thought and said, well, actually, probably not. Because even though we knew it was a risk, to authorize military aircraft to shoot down civilian aircraft after 9/11 is a brain-dead decision. To do it before 9/11 is the context of major mistakes in the Middle East and Korea. So the context doesn't allow a senior leader to make the decision. And people often make this mistake. You don't get to be C-level in a company unless you're contextually aware of what type of decisions you can get away with. It's not just the right decision, it's what you've got to do within the political context. So understanding that separation is key and creating separate processes for it. Next thing is, how many of you got children? Okay, how many have got teenage children? Right, one little tip on this, all right? This is a CIA interrogation technique. I don't recommend all CIA interrogation techniques for your children, although waterboarding is tempting at times. But this is a really simple one, all right? You know, when they come, they come home at 4 o'clock in the morning, and after you've hugged them because they're alive, you want to kill them because of the, everybody been there? Right, get them to, and they got this wonderful story about how their mobile phone didn't work and they had to look out. You all know those stories and you're pretty sure it's a lie. Get them to tell the story backwards. Human beings cannot lie backwards without errors creeping in. We can lie forwards with alacrity, but we can't lie backwards. And actually that's a really good, it's a good consultancy interviewing technique. Get people to walk backwards through something, you get closer to reality. Yeah? But the other point I wanted to make on this is, do you tell them stories about how Janet and John stayed at home, did what mummy and daddy said, and achieved the family KPIs and mission statement? Anybody do that? Now, just to tell you, depressed, there are companies in the States who now create mission statements and KPIs for families. Now, I'm very serious. I satirized it at a conference, and I was told and pointed to there are actually families which now do this. Yeah, and their whole consultancy group set up to do it. It's like I'm not allowed to mention evolution in the Ebola management event because evolution is a controversial theory, and this is to people trying to manage Ebola, right? Just, it's scary at the moment over there, right? Either way, come back to the point. What you actually do is you tell them stories about Janet and John went into the woods, met the evil wolf, you know, we do a told you so happy ending at the end. Basically, we learn through failure, not through success. This is a fundamental aspect of human beings. The stories which get spread in water coolers are stories of failure, not success. And actually the brain pays attention to failure instantly, but it may not even notice success. Yeah? And the reason is avoidance of failure is a more successful evolutionary strategy than imitation of success. Yeah, and that has major implications for learning. Yeah? So let's just run through some of them. Firstly, it's actually better to build worse practice systems rather than best practice systems. People like them and they pay more attention to them and they love it. If I look at the work we've done on safety in the aircraft industry, the story everybody tells is not I clipped on my safety harness and therefore I was safe. It's, do you know about Fred? He didn't clip on his safety harness. He fell 30 feet. Luckily, Joe was underneath and broke his fall. Joe broke his leg. This is a real story. Everybody tells that story and it improves safety. If you work with fighter pilots or test pilots, they all tell you multiple stories of how they failed or nearly failed. And what's fascinating is they all can recall other people's stories 20 years later. Yeah, the human brain evolved to remember and do very fast recall of failure stories, its own and other people's. So starting to build systems, and this is the other way we actually do corporate mission now, we get leaders to define what they don't want people to do, but leave open what they do, which is actually more ethical, more engaging, and more sensible because it's channeling behavior without being too specific. And that concept of direction of travel rather than goal is one I'll come back to frequently. The other thing, if you don't know it, and the reason for the picture, is that art and music come before language in human evolution. This is really important to understand. Now, like all evolution, it was an accident. We now know that evolution is survival of the luckiest, not survival of the fittest. Yeah? Darwin sort of hints at that, but he thinks that's probably even too controversial for him, all right, if you look at the notebooks. Yeah? Basically, we think what happened is, somebody drew something to help the hunt, it worked, but then what it actually did is it meant our language evolved from abstractions of the world, not from naming things. So if you look at Cretacean languages, they name phenomena, whereas human languages evolved from abstractions. And one of the major advantages of that is that you can make novel or unexpected connections between things. Because what abstraction does is it removes you from the material context into the abstract, and then you suddenly see different patterns. It's no coincidence that a lot of people have really good ideas, walking in the mountains, listening to music, and so on. Abstraction is key, which is why the current emphasis on STEM education is potentially disastrous in the West, because actually art is critical to invention in science. Yeah, this overfocus, that's one of my points about an overfocus on a computer model. So understanding that is key, because if I can increase the level of abstraction in a problem, I actually radically increase the chance of novel connections and radical understandings. If I actually make everything highly concrete and material, people will just carry on doing things the way they did. So there's kind of like a level of abstraction you need to maintain. And finally, one of the things we actually do a fair amount of, and we're about to package this up so other people can take it on and use it, is games in which people fail. How many Star Trek fans have I got here? Right, you know where we got the idea from? Yeah, fundamentally what we do is we set up 3 parallel teams, because this has to happen to people in parallel so they don't feel humiliated. They're given a situation. This is with a human games team, not a computer. Human games teams are really malicious, right? Which is what you want. We feed them data continuously. They don't get a passive system. Yeah, we've actually got microphones on their tables, so we know what they're saying, and we feed them deliberately disruptive but coherent data. It's a lot of fun being a games master. And at one point, they have to do a situational assessment and come up with an action plan. Then we send them away for an hour, and they come back, and whatever they decided to do has been totally and utterly disastrous. And we repeat 3 times. Yeah? By the time they're finished, they're scanning 30 to 40 times as much data before they make a decision than at the start. And we're capturing every single experience and idea as a self-interpreted narrative, which goes into a best practice or worst practice database, so we can use the learning from the exercise. So actually, training executives in situations where they fail provides far more learning than training them in situations where they succeed. And the large problem with management games is it's all about succeeding, in which case all you do is learn to play the rules. I remember when I did an MBA, I confess I did an MBA many years ago, we wanted to win the prize, so we checked the rules and we said, is anything not in the rules allowed? And they said yes. Yeah. So we bugged the other rooms. They hadn't said anything about spying, so we spied. Yeah. And we decided our most successful tactic was to make the other teams fail rather than try and win. So everything the other teams failed did, we moved to make their lives hell. So I think we lost £20 million, all right? Everybody else lost far much money, and they tried to stop giving us the prize, but we pointed out we played by the rules. Yeah? And that's the trouble. Yeah, if you have success-based stuff, people play to the rules, and you train them in the wrong way. Rule compliance becomes more important than the thing the rules are meant to be about. Yeah, so failure games are actually much more successful, and actually people really enjoy them. In a variation on it, we send in cultural anthropologists who've generally have forgotten more about culture than most consultants know in the first place, because they actually bother to read some books and think about it. Right? We basically send in cultural anthropologists who study it, then we sit them down with scientists who work with science fiction writers. All the really good science fiction writers have really good scientists working with them. If you ever go to a science fiction convention, which every intelligent human being should do once, you'll find Nobel Prize winning scientists having ferocious arguments about the science of, say, Robert Forward's high gravity beasts. So we're actually sitting down with these people and we create an alien planet, which is actually the company. And then we put managers into the alien planet in a survival game, and they don't realize they're solving real world problems. Yeah, this is actually Ender's Game. If anybody know Ender's Game? From the book, not the film. All right, the film totally destroys the book, because in the book, the whole concept is the kids don't realize they're still playing a game when they actually defeat the enemy, so they couldn't care less about how many people they sacrifice in doing it. Yeah, Ender's Game is an absolutely brilliant book, but an appalling film. Because in the fictional environment, people will do things that they won't do in fact. Yeah, and they learn more. Yeah? So, trying to give you some ideas as I go through. It's also linked with a key aspect of biology, and this is a neologism. This is called exaptation. Now, we had a significant problem with creationists, and by the way, it's got even more scary. 2/3 of chief knowledge officers in US government departments are young Earth creationists. Anybody been to the creationist theme park or the New Ark? Oh, it's worth going to, all right? 48% of the US population believe the world was created in the last 15,000 years. Right? Again, it's getting scary, all right, in terms of fact-based stuff. But basically, we had a problem because there isn't enough. If you take a Richard Dawkins concept of evolution, which is terribly linear, there isn't enough time. Oh, and by the way, no geneticists take the concept of a selfish gene literally, all right? It's just nonsense, all right? Basically, there isn't enough time for human intelligence to have evolved. Yeah, and what we actually get, and this is huge when it happened, this is with Stephen Jay Gould and later with Robin Odlin-Smee and others, discovered a thing called exaptation. So the best two examples of this, dinosaurs, and if anybody's got kids into dinosaurs, I'm about to give you a strategic edge because their books aren't up to date, all right? All dinosaurs had feathers. We now know that from discoveries in northern China. And it appears the feathers evolved primarily for sexual display. Yeah, because they're small and they're colored. I mean, there's actually one dinosaur which started to develop a skin flap like this, yeah, with colored feathers for better display. Those are the dinosaurs that when they fell off cliffs, glided. That's how we get flight. Yeah, a trait which evolved for one function, under conditions of stress, doesn't adapt, it exapts for something completely different. Yeah, and that's actually really important to understand because dinosaurs couldn't evolve wings by throwing themselves off cliffs in the hope it happened before they hit the ground, but they wouldn't get a chance to breed, right? Fins didn't become limbs when fish came on ground. Finger-type structures developed in marine plesiosaurs before they came on the ground. Yeah, the hippocampus at the foot of your brain evolved in humans to actually manipulate muscles in fingers so you could pick seeds from seed pods. It then exapts in humans to manage the huge sophistication of human grammar, which couldn't have evolved in a linear way. It required a non-linear switch. This does actually have consequences for health, by the way. Most of the things you use actually evolved for something completely different and then got reused for something else. Yeah? So just think about that. If you think it's not relevant, well, then make the connection between these. Somebody maintaining the magneto of a radar machine in 1945 noticed that a chocolate bar melted in their pocket and they realized the significance. We got microwave ovens. Now, of course, for everybody who actually saw the chocolate bar melted, only one person out of thousands realized the significance. Thalidomide, developed for pain relief, an appalling side effect in basically deformed children, but a major beneficial side effect, it cured leprosy. The whole of the pharmaceutical industry depends on side effects and effectively exaptive learning. It's like spandrels in architecture and all sorts of other things. Yeah? It's rapid repurposing. For anybody interested in climate change, this is one of the big areas of attention. Yeah, because actually we ain't got enough time for linear invention of stuff. We're going to have to radically exapt very fast. And what I'm going to talk about later is how you do exaptation in a company. So how do you actually find ways to rapidly repurpose what we already know to do something we didn't know was a problem? Yeah, and I'll come back to that when I come on to Kevin. So exaptive learning is critical, sometimes known as managing for serendipity. Yeah, if you know that phrase. Okay? Right, and that leads me on to complexity. Now I'm going to go through this, yeah, and then I'm going to give you a chance to sit and discuss and ask questions. But complexity is a key concept. It's a really, we can trace its origin to Prigogine in chemistry in Brussels. Now remember, Prigogine only died recently. Peter Allen, who is his PhD student, is a good friend of mine. This is comparatively recent. right? We get that in chemistry at the University of Austin. We get Brian Arthur in economics. We get a whole bunch of people in statistical modeling. We get people like Boasso and myself in social systems. So it's a relatively new field. And just to be clear, the language has not settled yet. Yeah, not everybody uses the language in the same way. And we're now starting to use complexity in a way a lot of people actually don't mean it. When people say complexity and say systems thinking, and by the way, complexity is nothing whatsoever to do with systems thinking. It's not a subset, it's radically different. Yeah, for reasons I'll go into in a minute. Yeah? Basically, chaos, complexity, languages use different disciplines. So I'm going to define my terms. Yeah? So basically in nature we have three types of system: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. And they go through a phase shift between them. Now, it's important you understand phase shifts. My children laugh at me around about this time of the year when I come in from the outside and say, it's going to snow, I can smell it. I grew up in the country, yeah, in a farming community. I can smell snow coming. Right? They can't because they haven't had the same experience or training. The reason I can do it chemically is when the liquid becomes a solid in the clouds, it throws out heat, which changes the chemical composition. So that's why you get that slight warming up, which you sort of smell and feel. You can sort of feel it if it's going to snow, because everything just warms up a little bit first. Yeah, when you boil water, it reaches 100 degrees, but it doesn't convert to steam until you put more and more heat in. And that's called a phase shift, or latent heat. Yeah? So actually, the shift between these three types of systems is a phase shift, yeah, which requires energy in or energy out in order to achieve the change. So an ordered system is one which is highly constrained. Yeah, it's contained and it's coupled, and the coupling is tight coupling. So everything is connected with everything else, everything is contained, we know what it is. My normal example of this is an operating theatre. Yeah, in operating theatres these days, we count the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation and check it's the same as was there at the start. As I get older, I think this is of increasing importance. Yeah, I know the figures on how many people had to have a second operation because scalpels or clips have been left in their stomachs, and it's over 10%. Yeah, and the checklist is therefore really valuable. The trouble is people forget the cost of order. Yeah, we're talking about 10 or 15 generations of knowledge which builds things into processes, extensive training, a huge expenditure on equipment, and critically a cognitive trigger. The act of scrubbing up when you go into the theatre actually triggers from who you are to the identity of the role you're going to occupy. That's actually how crews work. You've got identities interoperating with other identities rather than individuals. I can't replicate that on a day-to-day basis, and it makes a mistake if I do. So, for example, everybody got obsessed with checklists, and they're used everywhere. So I was doing safety work in British Columbia. This is with BC Power. And they have a difficult line. They maintain power lines. So for 5 months of the year, it's so cold, they have to wear masks, because if the air goes into their lung unwarmed, they die. For 5 months in summer, there are more grizzly bears in the area. And these days, grizzly bears are crossing with polar bears. You know about that one? It is really scary, because actually a grizzly bear won't interfere unless you annoy it. But as far as a polar bear is concerned, you're food. So we're now getting crossovers which people don't realize, all right? But either way, 5 months of the year it's bears, 5 months of the year it's death by freezing. So they have 2 happy months, all right, in spring and autumn. But they're Canadians, all right? I mean, you know what Canadians are like. I just put up with this stuff pragmatically, right? And the way they used to work is they'd arrive at a power line, it would be down. They'd sit on the back of the truck smoking cigarettes, and they'd talk about the job. They're mentally rehearsing, which is a type of cognitive activation. Then some idiot of a safety consultant came along and decided it wasn't explicit. So he destroyed the social process by creating a checklist. Now the foreman looks at the checklist, said, we've done this, haven't we, lads? Ticks the boxes. There's no mental rehearsal. And actually we had 5 critical deaths. But of course now nobody can be blamed or sued because there was a process. Yeah, we've just completed a major project in the northeast of England for which we are extremely unpopular. Is working with blue light services. This is police firearms squads, yeah, which in Britain isn't normal. Yeah, and these are very highly trained people, yeah, most mature people I know. Fire officers, ambulance drivers. What we found is the main cause of mental breakdown, which is becoming a major issue in the UK, actually wasn't the job, it was the health and safety regulations which were causing the mental breakdown, because the regulations were designed for the center of a normal distribution when people's reality is in the tails of a Pareto distribution. If you don't get that, I'll come back to that later. Right? Now, actually, what they wanted to do, we were very unpopular when we presented the results, because what senior officers wanted us to do was to endorse a 2-day mindfulness process program for everybody, so they could have a tick in the box and say they dealt with a mental health issue. Yet the reality is they need to rethink the regulations. Yeah? So order is valuable, but within boundaries. And the cost of obtaining order is very high. So you can't do it in other than a limited number of cases. And of course, if it's excessive, you get catastrophic failure. So I used to work for an Anglo-Dutch company called Data Sciences, and we were acquired by IBM. I didn't volunteer for IBM, I was conscripted, right? And the first thing they did was to ban alcohol and charge us for coffee. Now, this is completely unreasonable, right? We're a software developer house. Yeah, the coffee alcohol cycle is key to quality software development, right? Nobody should be expected to talk to users without alcohol first. You then need coffee to sober up to write the code. You then need even more alcohol to deal with the fact that users never want what you can prove they asked for, they want something else instead, right? And there are other reasons for that. So we got pretty fed up. We found a workaround, all right? Then it got worse. They banned us for buying food from staff. Yeah, you can't buy food for staff, it's a waste of money. Now, by now, we'd learned that you didn't argue with IBM bureaucrats or any HR department anywhere in the world virtually. Sorry about that. There are exceptions, all right? By logical arguments based on evidence-based approaches. So that didn't work, all right? The only thing which occasionally worked was the Socratic Technique. And remember, the danger is Socrates pissed off the people of Athens so much, they demanded he commit suicide, because Socratic Technique is wonderfully irritating, yeah? In which you ask people questions till they contradict themselves. So that's what we did. Yeah, so I went like, I'm a C-level executive by now, I've been programming for ages. I said, I got called out 4 o'clock in the morning the other day. Yeah, I was on duty. We got a VAX cluster which has gone down and a emergency service which is dependent on it. I didn't say the reason it went down is because you idiots cancelled the training budget because you said systems programmers could work from the manual. Yeah, and kind of like reading the manual in a crisis. Never mind, all right? And there's no point on that because they would argue it. Yeah. And I said, all I can do, all right, yeah, because if this isn't up by 9 o'clock, we've got millions of penalty clauses and God knows what else. My job is to keep everybody away from them so they can solve the problem. The last thing you want is managers running to them saying, what's going on, can I help you? They just need to be left alone. So my job is to create a shield around them and to feed them pizza and Coke to keep them awake. And I can't do that anymore because you banned food. And they did look slightly worried, and I realized there could be an error here. So I said, I did mean Coca-Cola, at which point they relaxed a bit, but we did get an idea from that. All right? And they said, oh, okay, well, and they said, what do you think you should do? And I said, well, we don't know. You guys are the experts. We're hugely impressed with the work you've been doing to create processes. We were a bunch of cowboys till you came along. And then you realize American HR people do not understand irony, so it becomes a deadly weapon. Yeah, and they said, okay, well, very well, vice presidential approval, 48 hours in advance is legitimate to buy food for staff. So you just breathe very slowly and you say, my God, you guys are brilliant, right? I would never, ever have thought of that. What happens on the extremely rare occasion where we don't get 48 hours notice of a major crisis? And now you realize sarcasm goes with irony, right? And they thought about it for a bit and they said, okay, country general manager approval after the event. That's a way of saying yes in a way which means no, which HR departments are really good at. And actually, if you work for IBM, you now know what will happen, right? Your expenses will disappear into South Bank. They'll never be signed. If you complain about it, your name will start to appear on the wrong sorts of lists. And you don't want to be on those lists at quarter end in a utilization-driven environment, all right? Because, it has consequences. So the practice emerged, and I hasten to add, of course, I never did this, and nobody I knew ever did this. We just heard that other people had done it. I want to be very clear on this, of overtipping London taxi drivers. Because I'm told, if you overtip a London taxi driver, they give you a blank receipt. The blank receipt, I'm told, was then filled out for the amount of food and drink bought for the staff. A parallel set of books were kept, signed off by the staff, so there was proof if needed. And the responsible manager claimed for a taxi, which was legitimate. yeah, and took the bus instead. Right? 20 years later, I gave that example at a conference in Berlin. 3 people from IBM ran up, showed me their wallets full of blank receipts, said, "We're still doing that. Did you invent it?" If you go into organizations, you will find thousands and millions of inefficiencies caused by people creating workarounds in order to make the system work despite itself. All the ethnography we've got in hospitals at the moment show that nurses have been forced to break the rules on a daily basis to provide empathetic care to patients. As a result of which, because breaking the rules becomes habitual, we get more safety issues. Yeah? And that's called a catastrophic shift. Yeah, the system actually isn't working the way you think it's working, but it's made to look like it's working. And that disconnect means sooner or later you'll get a catastrophic shift into chaos. And chaos is the domain of having no constraints. Which means if it happens accidentally, it's a disaster, but you'll get out of it quite quickly. The secret in chaos is to be the person who realizes you're in chaos, and often they won't, and to be the first person to create constraints, because that creates a trajectory out. Yeah, chaos is always a temporary state in humans. It's very energy effective. You've got to put a lot of energy in to keep a system chaotic. Human beings naturally make connections. Yeah? If we use it, it's an innovation space, and I'll show you how we use it for distributed decision support later. All right? But let's hold it for the moment. Chaos is an unconstrained system. Yeah? No constraints. Complex adaptive systems, on the other hand, everything is connected with everything else, but we don't know what all the connections are, and they're constantly changing. And we have this concept here called a dark constraint. That's a reference to dark energy in cosmology. We can see that a constraint is having an impact, but we can't see what the constraint is. You often find that socially evolved roles. So people you were about to make redundant occupied roles which had evolved over 2 or 3 generations to stabilize a system, and nobody actually knew what they did because it was only when they were needed they did it. So for example, the British Health Service got rid of matrons, a senior nurse role in the mainland, because nobody could see what they did. They didn't get rid of them in Northern Ireland because it was the height of the Troubles, and the matrons were holding the system together. Yeah, and actually after they got rid of matrons in the England, that produced hospital superbugs and all sorts of other negatives. Yeah, and that's called a dark constraint. You can see you've got a beneficial effect, but if you can't see what's causing that effect, you've got to be very careful what you remove, because you may have a dark constraint. That means that complex adaptive systems are inherently unknowable in terms of prediction. And the critical thing to realize, a complex adaptive system does not have linear material causality. You can't say if X happens, Y will always happen. Yeah, because actually the same thing will only happen again the same way by chance, not by design. So a complex adaptive system is constantly shifting and changing, and actually repeating patterns are dangerous because we start to believe we've got causality, and it may just be a temporary state. Yeah? Now the way you manage, and this is a revolutionary idea, is you first of all work out which type of system you're in before you decide how to manage. So if you're in an ordered system, you can do things like business process re-engineering. Everybody remember when that came in? Yeah, actually it was quite useful in many ways. The trouble is people extended it beyond its limits to things which are complex, at which point it breaks. And the trouble is most management methods developed in manufacturing, which is a closed system, then people applied them to services, which is an open system. And we now got Six Sigma. Anybody been Six Sigma'd yet? Yeah, we fondly call it Six Stigma. You know, it's business process re-engineering with the worst aspects of American Bible Belt fundamentalism added onto it for good measure. You know, it's kind of like a cult, and the high priests of the cult get given black belts to indicate their cult status, then exempt from doing any real work because their job is to impose cult discipline on people who do, right? There's nothing you can legitimately do with Six Sigma you can't do with a BPR method. If you don't know it, 3M abandoned it in all bar manufacturing because it was destroying their capacity to innovate. I mean, when the guy who imposed it at 3M went on to Boeing and tried to put it in there, 3 main board directors, and I quote literally, said, "We told him to fuck off because we'd never make another aeroplane." Yeah, because even in an engineering environment, they knew that level of constraint which would prevent all the things they needed to do. The trouble is it's now sold to government as industrial best practice, which is one of the ways you know a method has reached the end of its days, because consultants only sell to government as industrial best practice when they can't sell it to industry anymore because they've woken up to the deficiencies. And that's actually a literal truth. Okay, so these three systems are radically different. I said this is a science of common sense. I'm just speaking truth, all right? You all know that's the case, all right? Okay, so the best way I've ever learned to explain this, and this is what I want to leave you with, is to think about organising a party for a bunch of 9-year-old children. So can everybody imagine that? And you're making the fundamental error of holding it in your own house. Yeah, around about 7 or 8, you start to realise this is a bad idea, and you realise that community halls and church halls have fire hoses. And fire hoses are very useful for cleaning up after a children's party and are occasionally necessary for crowd control during the party itself, right? But you're making the mistake of holding, in your own house. So I want to look at how we would organise this party, based on what type of system it is. So if we assume a children's party is a chaotic system, that means there are no constraints. No constraints, no rules, which means the children will probably discover drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Your house will burn down in the process, but all property is theft and it was socially constructed in the first place, so why are you worried about it? There's a stiletto in that for certain academics, right? I don't recommend this. I've got a friend in California who did it once. He'd just come back from Burning Man and was enthused with the idea of spontaneous self-organization and didn't realize that with children that becomes spontaneous combustion, right? So I don't recommend that. The ordered systems approach, on the other hand, is taught in all good business schools. Under this, it's of critical importance to agree learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should be clearly articulated, and printed off on simple words with motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds and placed around the room where you're going to hold the party. You give the children, as they come in, Disney playing cards with the party value statement printed on the back of it, so they're aware of it. And of course, you produced a project plan for the party. The project plan has clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. And the senior adult starts the party with a motivational DVD. You don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. And then they use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party objectives and demonstrate to the children how their allowances are linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following the highly successful completion of the party, you conduct an after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If at this stage, for any remote reason, the children aren't happy, then you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who'll get them to tell happy clappy stories so they've got happy mental models and suitably indoctrinated they'll like whatever you put in front of them next time. Everybody reasonably familiar with this approach to party management? Right? I haven't finished yet. The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much simpler. And excuse one swear word here, but it's necessary. We start off by drawing a line in the sand, if you know that British phrase, called a boundary in complexity theory. We look the children squarely in the eye and we say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible boundaries. Because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle when you least expect them and breaking catastrophically. We then introduce catalytic probes, football, videotape, barbecue, computer game, in a hope a pattern of play will form, and it's called an attractor, but it's catalyzed, it's not created. The ball is the catalyst, it may create an attractor. That's important to understand. Right? If it's a beneficial one, we push more children towards it, we give it more energy. If it's negative, that's where you need the fire hoses. So what we do, and this is the phrase we got on the wall, you manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries, and the sequence is key. And you manage the only things you can manage in a complex adaptive system, which are the boundary constraints, the probes, and the amplification strategies. And that makes managing complexity much simpler and much cheaper than every management method you've heard so far. Because you can't manage to a goal that will produce the opposite of what you want. You manage the evolutionary potential of the present with a sense of direction, but not with a goal. And that leaves you open to novelty on the pathway. And you only manage what you can manage. Remember the horse over the household budget. Okay? Right. Okay, I've gone for an hour. Well, just under an hour. Now a chance, 10 minutes conversation. If you want to grab a coffee as well, that's fine. This is a chance to absorb that, ask questions if you haven't understood something. Go. What I want to do now is give you a simple heuristic to understand complexity. This is important because one of the main uses of complexity theory is actually in conflict resolution. You'll find an awful lot of conflict happens in the complex domain because the evidence supports multiple competing hypotheses. And you won't know what's right until you go and test them. One of the things about a complex system is you can't know the future in advance. You can only know the present. So one of the simple tests as to whether something is complex is this heuristic, is if the evidence supports conflicting hypotheses and contradiction cannot be resolved within the acceptable time frame, then it's complex. Now, that's a really simple test. And the reality of most C-level executives is they face this situation all the time, and they're forced to choose one option over the others, which means people overclaim the evidence for an option, and they're very reluctant to admit it failed. Yeah, so the system becomes more and more perverted over time because of the wrong assumptions. So that's kind of like the basic level definition of complexity. There are some basic implications of this, which I'll run through quickly. Retrospective coherence is a major danger. So that means with the benefit of hindsight, everybody can see a causal connection. So if you look at the congressional report on 9/11, which is worth reading, it basically finishes off with the phrase, why didn't we join up the dots? If you've all heard that phrase. Because with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that an FBI officer who noticed that people were being trained to take off and fly but not land is significant. Yeah, and then she gets hailed as a heroine and promoted. The reality is she was just one of many people who spotted things. And next time she's less likely to get it right than somebody else because you celebrated it too much. Yeah, if you look at any government inquiry or internal inquiry, somebody always spotted something in advance. We're doing work at the moment with social workers in Swansea, and every time a child is abused in the UK, the government hold an inquiry. With the benefit of hindsight, they can see what people should have done, so they create new rules and regulations. And the trouble is, if you now actually followed all the rules and regulations, you spent 90% of your time writing reports and no time in the houses doing it. And that's becoming an increasingly progressive problem. Teachers are suffering massive stress because of the requirement to make everything explicit, yeah, in terms of the way it works. So I say that's dangerous, but if we just take dots as an example, and this is a quick test for each table, given that you didn't answer any questions, I'm going to give you an exam question, all right? So every table has got to come up with an answer to this, and it's got to be a real number, and you've got to write it on a piece of paper so you can't change your mind after you see what other people have done, right? Okay, joining up the dots. If I have 1, 2, 3, 4 dots, yeah, then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 connections between the dots. Everybody got that? Okay, so 4 dots, 6 connections. I'll give you the figure. There are 64 possible patterns that can form of dots, connections, or any combination thereof. You'll get the formula in the Hasland handout. If I go up to 10 dots, how many patterns are there? You've got 1 minute on each table. Your life depends on it. You've got to agree on a figure and write it down. Go. "15 seconds. Got your answers written down? Okay, this is it. This table here, what's your answer? Yep. It's 1 million. Table behind you? 10,000. Try again. I'll give you a second. This table? This table? $10 million, table at the back. Yeah, this table, have you come up with a number now? Cowards. Okay, you're all way off. It's actually, no, that's life of the universe and everything, all right? It's actually greater than 3.4 trillion. If I go to 12, it's greater than 4.8 quadrillion. Yep, sorry about that. It's the emperor's chessboard, if you know that story. Yeah, 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, double thereafter. How many dots are there in the human system? How many possible patterns are there? With the benefit of hindsight, anybody can see a causal chain. But hindsight doesn't lead to foresight if the system is complex. This is really important, because the trouble is, when we look at it backwards, we think we see a causal chain. And you've also got to, it's much easier to explain this, to be honest, in Africa or Asia, because the religions there have not got what's called fundamental attribution error, which is a Western disease. They just know that some things are. Yeah, there's no reason for them to be, they just are. And if you start to think like that, that's complexity, yeah, in terms of the way it works. So that's one thing to be aware of. Secondly, and this is probably the most difficult thing to get across to people, although the system isn't causal, it is dispositional. So I can actually measure how it is disposed to act. So I can make statements about things which are more or less likely, or pathways which are easier or more difficult. Yeah, think about managing horses again. But I can't make precise statements, and I haven't got causality, but I have got dispositionality. And this, by the way, is we make a radical difference between systems thinking and complexity thinking, because the way systems thinkers draw maps is with boxes and feedback loops. Yeah, so they're assuming causality within the system as a whole that they can model. You can't model a complex adaptive system. To quote Merry-Go Man, the only valid model of a human system is the system itself. And that has major implications. Doesn't mean the models don't have utility, but you can't model the system, whereas the fundamental assumption of systems thinking, which remember really originates in cybernetics, is that it's all about models. And there's a lot of people in complexity who think it's all about agent-based models. Yeah, but I'll come back to that when as I point out frequently in the States, human beings aren't ants. The trouble is the modelers don't like that because their models don't work if you make the assumption that human beings have intelligence. But there again, they don't believe in evolution, so maybe that's the case. All right. There's no joke on this, but anybody hear about the singularity? There's this point in the future, Big Bang Theory wonderfully satirized it, if anybody didn't see it, where Sheldon realized his projected lifespan was 3 months short of the singularity, so he had to add 3. It's very funnily done, all right? If you genuinely believe that your intelligence could be transferred to a computer, your brain is probably ossified to the point where for you it may be possible, right? I've just written a whole bunch of blog series, including the one I wrote this morning, which is actually predated to the 5th of January because it was the 12 days of Christmas. Yeah, basically points out that actually Aristotle's concept of the soul, which doesn't mean some mystical creature, is human beings are more than their material self. Yeah. And actually kind of understanding that is key, because things that work for computers don't work for human beings and vice versa. Yeah. Next one. Interactions are more important than people. Now this is actually one of the really important insights of complexity, which transforms the cost of doing change. This myth has grown up in Northern Europe and North America that every system is an aggregation of individual choices, when actually it isn't. Yeah, actually systems, the interactions between people determine how people respond, and you can change interactions at much lower energy costs than by changing people. And it's actually more ethical, considerably more ethical. It's why things like Myers-Briggs are detested by anybody with any real knowledge of science. Because the idea that you can be predetermined into one type or class of people is an entire product of the engineering metaphor which falsely dominated theory from the 80s. And HR departments want to put people into little categories. And always reminded of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Have you read that? Which, by the way, he thought was a utopia if you actually read the literature, not a dystopia. yeah, in which people are decanted. And there's a famous phrase, I'm so glad I'm a beta. I don't have to do the hard work like the alphas or wear the dull grey clothes like the deltas. Ever remember that phrase? That's somebody, well, I'm an IMBJ, right? It's exactly the same phenomenon, yeah? So it's important to understand that because it makes change easier. It's also about heuristics. Now, if you look at military history, which is important, Napoleon transformed warfare. The reason all the crown kings of empire, I mean, the whole of Europe conspired against Napoleon because he actually had professional officers from the working classes rather than the son of somebody you could afford to buy a commission, if you know the way the Swedish and the British Army worked at the time, right? That was one thing, but the really important thing he did is he basically said, if in doubt, march to the sound of the guns. That's called a heuristic, and that actually transformed warfare. Because up till that time, you waited for orders, or you just did what you thought was right, and you didn't know what other people are doing. Now, if you don't have orders, there's a general principle you follow, and you know that the other generals are following the same principle. So the army starts to have self-organizing capacity. And that was huge. Yeah, if you look at the work that several of us did with the Marines, Klein did it, I did some work on it towards the end. They're basically now capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. Yeah, you see what that is? Now the point is, this isn't an abstract statement like be good to your staff. I mean, it's amazing the nonsense you see come out of corporates when they spend 8 or 9 days discussing their key objectives, their key mission statements, and they come down like Moses from the mountain, but without the tablets, with a set of platitudes. Oh, you just spent 3 days saying we should put our customers first? Well, we did kind of like know that, all right? You know, was it worth doing that, all right? Heuristics are hard and measurable. Yeah, it's not, you know, did you try and capture the high ground? Did you stay in touch? Did you keep moving? Yeah. Now, this is important in a whole variety of phases. Some of the work I've been doing with one was leading fashion houses, which is one of my favorite clients, because they tend to throw the, you know, fly the Paris ballet in to perform for you in the desert when they're doing their top management team. You know, I'm allowed one indulgence, right? But in that fast-moving environment, we need to identify heuristics because you can't manage based on rules. You've got to have a distributed command structure, but you've got to have a degree of control. So one of the ways you control a complex system is by heuristics. Now, 2 examples on this. For my various sins, I have actually written 2 ISO 9001 manuals in my life. Anybody done an ISO 9001 manual? Okay, so I got summoned in to see the managing director, and he said, I want you to write the ISO 9001 manual, and it's mission critical. And I said, why me? I'm the one who breaks the rules. Last time I was in here, yeah, you were beating me up for something that actually you would have done yourself, but we agreed you beat me up in public, all right? Because I had a good arrangement with the managing director, right? He said, yes, but, you know, poachers make the best gamekeepers, if you've ever heard that phrase. He said, you'll write something people like you will follow. He said, if I give it to quality control, we'll end up with a 5-volume set of rules, a 3-week training course, and we'll never pass. Yeah, so, okay, yeah, it's in my interest, so I went and did it. I had 75 pages, and it was a series of do case statements. I was a programmer, right? So if this happens, we do this. If this happens, we do this. That were the rules. Then it finished off each one. If it wasn't, everybody wasn't agreed. I simply said, if anything else happens, you assemble people in these 3 categories and they minute their decision. Right? Which is actually, I didn't know about complexity at the time, but that's what I would now do from a complexity perspective. You only write down rules if there's no ambiguity. If there is ambiguity, you create a repeatable process, which of course is all you need for an ISO 9001 manual to handle the ambiguity. And I force into the 3 cognitive diversity. Yeah, that was me intuitively realizing you couldn't afford to have, you had to have somebody from outside your business unit was one of the 3. Yeah, designated as such. We had a parallel manual, which is the book of managers who couldn't be trusted to answer questions from quality inspectors properly. And we were a secure site, so if the inspectors ever arrived, they were held up by challenging their identity while we evacuated all managers, yeah, so that their nominated deputies who'd been trained to answer questions rather than do the job could be there for the quality inspectors. Yeah. Either way, I then had to go and do it for one of his friends' companies, and I could have had a life doing that, but I decided not to. Now, that's an example of heuristics and rules. Now, the personal example, my daughter is now this high and charming. Yeah. apart from the critical essay she's writing on my misuse of Deleuzean epistemology and the fact she thinks I don't really understand assemblage theory, which makes life at home entertaining, all right, but actually it's a lot of fun. But a long time ago, she was running around on the Irish ferry, and I suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, realised I've never moved faster in my life, and literally grabbed her by one hand just before she disappeared over the back of the ferry. I hadn't realised she was that into exploration and climbing up rails, all right? You have these moments as a parent. So I got a halter, yeah, and I got her one of those dog leads, which is extendable, yeah, which you clip on with a carabiner. Her mother didn't really approve of this. I thought it was ideal, all right? You let her run out, you reeled her back in, all right? So either way, 2 days after this, we're in Conwy in North Wales, which has got a wonderful castle, yeah, symbol of English oppression, but it's good for the tourists. So we're up at the top of the castle, and we're now doing father-daughter stuff. And you know fathers and daughters make terrible combinations. I still remember when Eleanor curled up beside me on the sofa and pointed the brown eyes at me and said, "Daddy, Mummy doesn't understand me," all right? This is a deadly weapon daughters use from time to time, all right? Yeah, it's like, so either way, we're doing father-daughter stuff. So, you know, mother and baby brother don't like heights. So we're on the top of the castle and we're leaning over the wall and holding on for dear life, and I've got the thing tied. So it's perfectly safe, but we're causing consternation down, and Eleanor's giggling at the panicky screams coming from downstairs, all right? So this is the way it works. Yeah, it's about high up. Unfortunately, I didn't realize she was holding her fluffy toy rabbit in her arms. And so she dropped the rabbit, which now drops down 20 feet and lands on a ledge. Now this is the rabbit without which we cannot sleep at night. You know those rabbits? I am now in deep, deep trouble. It's not just that I will have to be the one who handles the sleepless nights and the screaming child, but I know that on my deathbed, the family will reassemble with the entire purpose of telling me this story, all right? I mean, that's what our family's like. We have an oral tradition in Wales, and it's both good and it's bad, all right? And that's one of the bad aspects, right? So I was then a climber. From a climber's point of view, a castle wall is nothing. It's vertical. It's got handholds. So I tied her to the flagpole with the reins, went over the wall, climbed down, collected the rabbit, climbed back up, handed over the rabbit, got a wonderful hug. I still remember that hug. Untied her, went down to the castle to be met by the entire Conwy police force, who'd finally had a crime. Yeah, and after 20 minutes in the police station, right, they kind of like, they were fathers too, so Eleanor was spoilt rotten, and we had tea and swap daughter stories. And then I suddenly realized I hadn't told my wife what was happening, and we had to go and find, all right? But that's another story, all right? Now, when I went over the wall, I don't often do that, all right? Just to be clear, all right? This is rare, and I may show you a picture later about when I did do it and it wasn't a bad idea. So I knew I was at risk, because rule breaking, if it's exceptional, it increases the adrenaline surge and you pay attention. Yeah, and actually, therefore, I'm fairly safe. And I suddenly started to repeat myself, something I hadn't said since I was trained to climb on the Idwal slabs over a decade before: 3 points of contact, 3 points of contact, 3 points of contact. You don't move one limb till the other three are secure. So breaking the rules exceptional, I'm following a heuristic, I'm safe. Now we're now doing that extensively in companies. Where you can define the rules, you define the rules. But then you have a rule for who and when the rules can be broken, and a heuristic which applies on the other side of the boundary. And that's one of the key things to understand about managing complexity. And the other thing to understand about a complex adaptive system is you will fail. One of the big problems we've got in hospitals at the moment are people are trying to create fault-free environments. And on a single morbidity side, you may be able to do that, but most people come into hospital with multiple morbidity, and you can't a priori prevent failure. And if you say you won't fail, people will not report failure early enough for you to do something about it, so the failure is catastrophic. Yeah, it's the old fail fast, fail early, but that only applies if the system is complex. So that leads me on to the Cynefin framework. Yeah. And what I'm going to do is to go through this, talk about some of the basic things we do, and then give you another conversation. Yeah, and we're going to do the narrative in the final section. Right? I'll just introduce it briefly. Cynefin looks like this. It's a Welsh word. Its literal translation into English is habitat or place. but nobody in Wales would use it for anything that trivial. The English actually don't have a word for this, which says something about them. Its meaning in Welsh is the place of your multiple belongings. It's a sense of being rooted in many different pasts which profoundly influence what you are, but of which you can only ever be partially aware. And it's very different from the German word Heimat, which is a return to the past. Cynefin is a concept of being part of a continuous flow of social and physical interaction. So it's a good name for a complexity model. The reason the English don't have an equivalent, by the way, is they've never had a habitat of their own. They've only ever stolen other people's. Yeah, and that includes you bastards who came across the North Sea, but let's not get into that, right? So that's why I called it Cynefin, all right? Yeah, it's a good name for it. And basically, it divides order into two, where the relationship between cause and effect is obvious and where it's complicated. Now, this is an important distinction because, as you all know, in civilized countries, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. Yeah, so if you're in the UK, you drive on the left. If you're in Sweden, you drive on the right. If you're in Italy, south of Naples, you follow the next car, match speed, avoid collision, and ignore the rules. If you don't know it, it's been studied, right? Italian drivers south of Naples flock. Yeah, that's actually a flocking algorithm. I can now drive the Alfini coast stress-free because I've given up worrying about the regulations and I just follow the next car, match speed, avoid collision, and it kind of like all works. If anybody's ever driven the Alfini coast, you know it's an interesting experience. Yeah? But the point is, it's a categorization thing, all right? Yeah, UK drive on the left, Sweden drive on the right. Yeah, and I still remember when I was a young kid, when you guys changed from driving on the left to driving on the right. It was all over the BBC. Yeah, I mean, it's hysterically funny, but what would happen if you tried to do it now? I hate to think, all right? So basically, I sense, categorize, respond, and apply best practice, and critically, I have fixed or rigid constraints. Now, this is an extreme form. Everything is tightly coupled. And that's the only space where you can apply best practice is where there is an obvious relationship between cause and effect, and everybody understands it and agrees to it. And even then, it's not absolute. If you only drive, if a kid runs on the road in front of you, you drive on whatever side of the road you need to do to avoid them. Yeah, if you actually insist on that, you end up falling over the edge into chaos again, because people have to break the rules. Yeah, all rules ultimately have a condition under which they're broken. A complicated word, on the other hand, is one where the relationship between cause and effect may be obvious to the expert, but it's not obvious to the decision maker. And the problem is we expect experts to make decisions when the system is complex, which means they're going to get it wrong. So we don't trust them when they're actually right in the complicated domain. In the complicated domain, you can trust expert judgment, but you can't in the complex. And again, it's this not one-size-fits-all concept. Yeah. So in this point, I basically sense, analyze, respond. I have to do some sort of investigation, but there is a linear relationship between cause and effect. So there is a right answer. But here, I apply good practice, not best practice. And that's a really important distinction. Because the constraints here are what are called governing constraints. Which basically means, provided I've got a certain level of qualification or experience, I can vary the practice. And a big problem with consultancy-driven initiatives is they drive good practice into best practice domains. And they lose credibility as a result. Yeah, so although this boundary is not a phase shift, the other boundary is a phase shift, this is a spectrum, it's a really important distinction as to which you're in. Yeah? If you get this wrong, you end up in chaos. And if you're in chaos, you act, sense, respond. Yeah, you have to act very quickly. And what matters now is who acts first controls the exit. Yeah, that's very simple. If anybody's done crisis management, you know the most important thing is to make decisive decisions, even if they're wrong. Yeah, you're not consultative, you're not democratic. It's okay, yeah, and if you're clever about this, you create constraints so you can see what patterns exist. Crisis management is about creating sufficient constraint that you can see the pattern forward. That's one of the things we actually train managers on in the failure games, is how do you create constraints rather than endpoints. Yeah, because that gives you more resilience. And basically what I've got here is I have no constraints. right, in terms of the way things work. Everything's free, and practice here will always be novel or radically different. One of the simplest techniques I ever developed is if you have a crisis management team, everybody got a crisis management process? Have an innovation process which gets triggered in parallel. You've never had a better chance to innovate than in a crisis. Once the crisis is over, it's too late. Yeah, never waste a good crisis. Yeah. And one of the things we actually do, coming back to the earlier speaker, is sometimes you create micro chaos within a contained space, but I'll come back to that shortly. Right? In a complex world, okay, sorry. Okay? Well, you have to remember I'm a partial dyslexic, so I've developed the dyslexic's habit of bad handwriting to disguise appalling spelling. I never understand why everybody wants all the words in the right order. If they're all there, what's the problem, right? Basically, in a complex world, I have enabling constraints. And it's important to realize that constraints are not negative in complexity, they're critical. Without constraints, you don't get evolution. We're running a big seminar in Seattle shortly where I'm working with guys who work on theory of constraints. So we're combining Cynefin with theory of constraints over 2 days. That just went up on the website. And that's actually a very important workshop, yeah, in terms of the way it works. Yeah? So if anybody fancies a trip to Seattle, that's on shortly. Basically, in a complex domain, remember, we can only understand the system by interacting with it. And we have multiple hypotheses. So we probe sense-respond, but we probe in parallel. Every coherent hypothesis gets a small amount of money to run a safe-to-fail experiment. And this makes life a lot easier if you're a senior executive. What's the problem? What's complicated? What's complex? If it's complicated, which experts, what analysis process, when will they report, what will it cost? It's complex. What's the list of coherent hypotheses? Where's the list of safe-to-fail experiments? When will they complete? We've actually got forms for this if anybody wants it, and portfolio control forms. Because actually you have to have a process, you have to start from where people are. And that actually saves a huge fortune, because if you move immediately into safe-to-fail experiments in parallel, you don't waste 6 months trying to investigate something. You change the space and you get strategic advantage. For anybody into the OODA loop, this means you go round the OODA loop faster than the competition. Yeah, because you understand the nature of the system. And basically, yeah, what we've actually got here is the practice is exaptive. The way you manage in a complex space is you actually rapidly repurpose. And to repurpose, you've got to store your knowledge at the right level of granularity. And I'm going to come back to that in the final session today. Yeah, one of the things we do, and I'll mention it now so you've got it, is the way we make decisions is called conceptual blending. Remember I said earlier, you scan 3 or 4% of what's in front of you and you combine patterns. What you do is you combine fragmented memories to come up with a unique form of action in this context. It's why human beings do not follow processes and do not follow best practice documents, because actually the way we evolved to make decisions is to quickly assemble half-remembered fragments in context. And that gives us evolutionary advantage in the complex space because we're not over-constrained. And so knowledge management systems need to do the same recall. Yeah, and that's actually a very different way of doing it. I'll talk later on about the work we did with the US Army in Afghanistan on this. The final thing about Cynefin, which is important, is this space here is called disorder. It's the state of not knowing which of the domains you're in. Which means you'll actually follow whatever pattern you find most comfortable. And so it's not the same as chaos, it's inauthentic. It's a state of not doing what you should do. Now, I'm not going to go to this in depth, but just to flag it up to you, Cynefin also has what's called a liminal domain. Liminality in anthropology is a key concept. It's a state of suspended transition before you change. Yeah? So on this liminal area here, this is where you've done multiple parallel safe-to-fail experiments, And now I pick 2 or 3 things and I do linear iteration to solidify them and make them complicated. For the agile people amongst you, this is where Scrum belongs. Yeah, so there's a whole body of techniques which we currently practice, which people say are complex. They're actually not. They're liminal, because they're about shifting things from complex to complicated, and that's their value. This here is where I create micro chaos. I contain a contained space without restriction to create novelty. And of course that takes a lot of energy because I've got to contain it. It's also where we use what's called distributed decision support, which means none of the agents making a decision are connected with any of the other agents. You all know about wisdom of crowds? The example I most like is the USS Scorpion, I think, a submarine. It grounded off the coast of Portugal in the 1960s. It didn't sink. I was corrected on that by an admiral in Norfolk Navy Base. He pointed out submarines are designed to sink. And I learned from that, if somebody has got stars in their shoulder, particularly 3 or 4 stars, let them humiliate you in the first 3 minutes, then it's out of the system, and they'll listen to you thereafter. So what they did is they gave partial data to groups of experts around the world, including Nova Scotia fishermen. Partial was key. All of them estimated where the submarine was without knowledge of the other groups. None of them got it right, but a probability distribution of all of the estimates was 600 meters away from the submarine. Now we're now doing that, and I'll come to that in the final session. Some of the work we're doing with cities, for example, is to allow cities to ask the whole population a question in real time. Yeah, as a way of actually creating distributed decision support, so that you don't have to spend 3 months investigating a problem. Yeah, and that becomes critical in that space. All right, so that's liminality, yeah, in terms of the way it works. Sorry. Okay, I'll have to draw that. I failed to do it properly. Right? Final thing to say on this, and this is what I want to leave you with, is constraint mapping. Now, I've used constraints a lot. Yeah. And this is really flagging up something later. But I'll come back to something you should have realized by now. None of you can actually assess a situation objectively. Because you've actually, the minute you're presented with a situation, you form a subconscious hypothesis about what you're going to do, because we're very action orientated as a species, and you assess the situation to validate that form of action. Now, you've all been on committees where this happens. Everybody gets together, they know the subject, and everybody's emphasizing different parts of the evidence based on what worked for them last time. We generally try and repeat what worked for us last time. And you see this in the form, well, let me tell you when. Anybody heard that phrase in the meeting? Yeah, I was there, right? Actually, that's a mistake. So one of the ways we get around it, because you can't stop that, so don't try and train people not to, that's stupid, is we say we don't look at the situation, we map the constraints. And then we can ask a series of questions about what happens if you change that constraint, what will happen to the system. This is a key part of complexity. We change the granularity of the conversation to something which can be managed rather than looking at the system as a whole, which is kind of like paradoxical, but it's important. And this is part of a typology of constraints. And if you don't know the difference between a typology and a taxonomy, okay, I assume you don't, because a taxonomy puts things into categories. A typology looks at things from different perspectives. The danger with a taxonomy is it doesn't cope with boundary conditions well. So under ambiguity, you want typologies, not taxonomies. Cynefin, by the way, starts as a typology and then can be used as a taxonomy. But that's kind of like for a more advanced course. Yeah. Now, what we're doing here is to look at different types of constraint. Do they contain or do they connect? That's actually quite important. Yeah, because if I've actually got a rigid containment, I'm not too fussed what happens between, because I'll see boundary connections. Whereas something connected, the boundary is more fluid. Yeah. Secondly, are they resilient or are they robust? Now, this is one of the things I'm never quite sure how Swedish works on that, because we know efficiency and effectiveness are the same word in Swedish, but the difference is vital in English, all right? So I don't know about this one, but basically a resilient system is one which survives changed. A robust system survives unchanged. And an anti-fragile system is a type of resilience, by the way. I don't know why Taleb wants to make it distinct. We've known about anti-fragile systems for centuries, and they're always classed as resilience. But if you've got to publish a best-selling book every 2 years, then you have to do this sort of stuff, right? Basically, my metaphor for this is the difference between a seawall and a salt marsh. In fact, it's a real case. So if I have a seawall, it's very robust, and it's definitive, and I can drain the land on the seaward side, and make it fertile. The trouble is, when it breaks, it's catastrophic. Yeah, anybody got any friends in Amsterdam who's moving to? You feel sorry for Amsterdam, all right? Because Breda is getting an influx of people. They're working out what's happening on property prices. There's only so long Amsterdam can hold the water up. Yeah. Now the interesting thing is salt marshes are more resilient. Yeah, because actually, when the moment in England, there's geological justice, by the way. England is sinking into the North Sea while Wales is rising up out of the Atlantic, all right? So we may have to wait a few million years, but we'll have the buggers drowned, all right? But basically, what they're actually doing is they're demolishing seawalls because we're getting catastrophic floods and allowing salt marshes to re-emerge, which means we lose the fertile land. Wildlife is good, but a salt marsh, once it's saturated, doesn't release the water. Right, so you can see the metaphor here. Are your constraints really resilient or robust? And within that, we have different categories. And the final one, which I'm going to hold for tomorrow, is are your constraints scaffolding or are they permanent? Are they things you're putting in place in order to allow something to emerge, or are they permanent intent? But I'll come back to that tomorrow. Yeah. Now, what I've done in this first session, and I've left you with about 5 minutes to assimilate it, but you didn't ask many questions the first time round, so I assume you're not this time, and I'm back twice more. So we'll open up the next session with a chance to ask questions. Yeah, is what I want you to think about is kind of like what I've tried to do is get across the fact that the first thing is to work out what type of system you're in. All right? Then life gets easy. So all the things you currently do, if I look at the management literature, are probably valid. Yeah, I mean, I made the point about Six Sigma compared with BPR, but if you've got Six Sigma, you might as well keep it, but just ramp it back to manufacturing. Yeah? You have to work out what type of system you're in, then you can apply an appropriate method. Yeah, if you're in the complex world, you can't know the future, so we actually switch from predicting the future to anticipatory triggers. Now that's something I may talk about tomorrow. That's the big thing we're doing in social work. I can't predict that a child will be abused, but I can trigger an alert when the plausibility of abuse has reached a stage where a social worker should spend more time in a house. And that's the big stuff we're now doing on strategic foresight, is you can't predict the future, but you can trigger alerts when human beings should pay attention. Now, there's a new Springer handbook coming out, which I'm on the editorial committee of, and the big theme there is anticipatory triggers, not prediction. Yeah, so how do you bring human beings into play? Yeah? So kind of like in a complex system, we also understand it by exploring things. If we change a constraint, I make this fixed constraint permeable. See what happens. If it doesn't work, I can remove the permeability. It's all about changing the things I can manage and seeing what happens and then responding. It's not about deciding in advance what it should be. And fundamentally, we move from an engineering metaphor of the organization to an ecological metaphor of the organization. And also, we respect the reality of humans, and how we've evolved to be is what you've got to deal with, not what you would like us to be in a perfect world. So deal with reality, and the key phrase here is the one on the wall, yeah? Manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, yeah? Within boundaries, and then critically, manage the evolutionary potential of the present. In systems thinking, people define a future state and try and close the gap, which is why all these change initiatives fail, because they're never going to achieve in their goals. The minute you have a change initiative with the objective defined, you guarantee failure and you guarantee disillusionment. In complexity, we start by describing the present and then seeing what we can change and monitoring as we change to see what works and doesn't. We start journeys rather than trying to achieve goals. Okay, all right, it's yours for conversation. You've also got a coffee break, and I will allow for questions at the start of the final session. Go.
Yes.